Hello and welcome to this Globe Educate webinar, and I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by Rita Bateson today. And Rita is an IB educator, a author, a curriculum writer. Rita, thank you so much for joining us today. Would you like to expand on that brief introduction I've made?
I'd love to. Thank you so much for asking. I have been in the IB education world. I've been a teacher for longer than I'd care to admit. And I think I'm now technically into my third, if not fourth decade of education. And recently I have been engaging with AI as an educator and as a curriculum developer. And I think that's probably where most of my attention, and in fact, probably many of our attentions have been focused on that. So I've founded a company with another colleague called Ablana Learning, and we're supporting schools. And mostly the demand is obviously with the ethical and sustainable side of AI. So schools worrying about the impact, excited about the opportunities, and navigating that balance in between the two. That's really where it occupies most of my days.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rita. Now, yesterday, Rita, I know you did a keynote speech and you'd like to share some of what you talked about yesterday with us today. Just where were you yesterday, and who were you talking with?
Yesterday, I was the keynote opening speech for the E-Assessment Association. That was in London. They do a 3-day annual conference, and their day one, as with most people, was focused on AI. So they had an AI symposium, which they asked me to set the tone and bring some of the learnings that I've experienced from both Ireland and working with international schools around the hidden cost of AI. So they were very interested in, as AI significantly impacts assessment for the good and for the bad, what should they be thinking about? What should be a part of the conversation? And I think it was from that perspective, it was really useful, because quite often the green agenda or the consideration of the environment isn't the first thing in our AI conversations. It's often financial or pedagogic or reputational, ethical, but we're not thinking enough about the sustainability. So that was the focus. It was very well received, and I understand then that it subsequently was referenced by almost all of the speakers, and so it was the perfect opportunity to kind of insert that conversation.
Why do you think we're not thinking about it? Why is it not at the top of our thinking when we think about AI?
I think, first of all, it was shiny and exciting, and we didn't have the numbers to do the calculations. I think that's really, really what it comes down to. It's certainly not in big tech's interest to make us very aware of it, because I think if we truly start investigating, for that you need open source information. You need really clear calculations from the companies. And at the moment, they're working at such speed, I'm not even sure they could do that even if they wanted to. So that's something that I think is really important to share with everybody. Some of it may be benign, some of it may be malignant, I'm not sure. But throughout the conversation, I think what we'll see is the statistics that underline it, or that kind of belie all of their decisions, suggest that it is definitely significant, and it's something we should be considering. Now, not avoiding AI entirely, not being anti-AI, but certainly considering what is conscious consumption look like in AI, both for our, like this phrase, don't leave your mind behind. We certainly don't want to leave the planet behind either. So that's really, really key. So I was talking to them about kind of the things we've noticed. I opened with, like, I'm coming from the future, which of course I'm not, but I'm coming from a potential future here in Dublin where we're noticing this already significantly having an impact on the consumption on the electricity grid. So I started with kind of tales from the land of saints, scholars, and data centers. And then I introduced them to a few concepts, which I'd love to share with you today for your audience. And then some suggestions, some case studies and hypothetical situations, so that we can really build this into our schools' cultures.
Sorry, I am listening.
No,
what I just wanted to add is that what is interesting, and I had this conversation with the teenagers in my house who seem to be far more environmentally aware than I was at their age. It is often the first thing they talk about with AI is about the environmental impact it has. Now, they're not particularly avid users of AI. I think one daughter does, but they all are very aware of it. And I think they're perhaps more aware of it than my generation.
I think I probably agree, because I see it was on TikTok where I first saw this conscious underconsumption trend, like a subculture, where they were very actively using things up before throwing them away and repairing, and so this really celebrating this underconsumption vibe. And I thought, well, that's just like normal life, isn't it? But for them, in a culture of abundance, I think it's really significant that they are thinking about it. So I borrowed from that idea where, you know, influencers will post these kind of thinking frames. Should I buy it? Am I buying it because I'm emotional? Will I still wear it in 5 years' time? To counteract fast fashion. And I thought that's exactly it. That's what we should be doing with AI. We don't want to have fast AI. We don't want to have reckless consumption and adoption without thinking about it, because it has got an impact. In Dublin, where I am at the moment, and one thing that we planned for in case we had a blackout on this call, was the fact that the data centers are based in Dublin, many of them for Europe. And because of GDPR, and they have to be housed in certain, you know, jurisdictions. And also we're a very big tech friendly economy here in Dublin, to say the least. And I think it's really important that we know that already 20% of the grid in the entire country is dedicated. And in Dublin, it's even worse. It's 50% of our grid, and probably higher by now, because I haven't had an updated statistic on that for a while. But the fact that half of our energy is dedicated to the fact that those centers cannot go down. They cannot have disrupted streams, which means they can't really be renewable sources. They definitely have to be something much more direct. And we see a move towards nuclear in many, many countries at the moment to feed this unquenchable thirst, I think, for AI, because we know that those numbers were nothing like that 5 years ago. Absolutely minimal. So
that's a remarkable figure. 50%.
It's incredible, isn't
it? Yeah, yeah.
And I think some people realize there's part of that is, you know, electricity is having to be diverted to feed these centers for sure. And we know that, and we've experienced some blackouts. I can't correlate it to Spain and Portugal, for example, because we don't really know what happened there. But I certainly know that if this 50% indicates a doubling in consumption, and we've only really been having massive experimentation in the last kind of 18 months with ChatGPT. And when you walk around the classroom and you see every single student with their laptop has at least one tab open for AI at some point, then it's kind of staggering to think of how that scales and magnifies as we go through the potential future for education. It's huge. And that's not talking about industry, that's not talking about enterprise, just in education. It's significant. And it's gotten to the point where I think the government is almost now, without admitting it, they're almost admitting that we're not going to meet our climate goals, our 2030 goals. And the reports in the papers are kind of talking about how are we going to find the money to pay these fines, given that we are definitely not going to meet our targets. And I think that's really sad, because we were on track. We were doing well. We do have significant reductions. And the agriculture sector, for example, is under massive pressure to reduce there. And I can understand how they might look sideways at AI and think, well, that's very well for them, isn't it? So I think that's something that's important. And one of the suggestions that has been made, and kind of credibly made, was that Google and Amazon and Microsoft were urging the Irish government to allow them to build their own grids effectively. Not talking about where the supply would come from, but essentially saying increased AI demands much, much higher energy. And it cannot, our infrastructure, I don't know if you can identify with this, but our infrastructure is not capable to handle all this. It's just simply out of control. So I think that's something that I would love to have that in the back of our minds when we think about consumption of plastic, and when it's such a physical, visual thing, and AI seems invisible. It seems free, and it's friction free, and it's cost free to the greater or lesser extent. But we know this model. We know freemium, right? We know the nature, the need to get addicted to it so that eventually you will pay for it. And I think that's, I don't know, do you have any kind of subscriptions like that you pay almost against your will, but you can't afford to lose?
Yes, I guess with Apple. Now I've been a Mac user since late 90s, early 2000s, and it's fantastic and I love it. But I realize I am now a hostage of it. All my music's on it, all my photographs are on it. I need, every now and again, I get requests to up my storage cloud package because I'm now exceeding or near exceeding it. So I then have to make that choice. Do I move everything somewhere else for free, or do I pay for the next? And I do feel like a complete hostage to it. Yeah.
I am too. I pay for Flickr because all of my memories and photographs are on there. I've abdicated that storage to, I mean, as soon as we move to the cloud, you do relinquish a great deal of control, right? Your sovereignty is virtually gone. And I pay it, not willingly, but I certainly pay it in the certainty that I will need that in the future. And likewise, if I think about buying something that isn't an iPhone, the dread within me of changing and learning a new system it's definitely within the think. It's within the model. So as we have, I mean, there's got to be a reason ChatGPT is looking to give it free to students in every school. Building a market demand, building a requirement, kind of targeting the younger students, and that lifelong brand loyalty is significantly important to them. We know that already. We can see it. We can see how quickly we got dependent on Google, and students are very dependent on YouTube for resources, things like that. So we can see this model already. We've learned from social media. We just haven't really enacted those lessons yet. And I think that's cruel. That's really crucial. And one of the things I think people forget is that the consumption is borne by someone. It's really important that we think about the energy that's required within those data centers, and the heat that comes off those servers and server racks is phenomenal. Now, with Ireland, it's not an issue. We're not exactly short of water from rain, so that's not a significant concern for us, but it will be eventually. And certainly the quality of the water is important. So you might hear kind of AI hype gurus saying, well, the water cycle, the water will come back. Even if we use it for cooling, it goes into the atmosphere, it comes back again. But it's the access to that water. I think it's the access to the drinking water, the communities that it will disadvantage because of it. And simply, if you're thinking about these massive data centers in Saudi, for example, how on earth are they going to cool that significantly? How are they going to make this 1.3 trillion base in the UAE? I don't know if you saw this, but the numbers are staggering. And so it's not just the access to electricity, because if you have virtually unlimited solar energy in a location like that, by dint of that, you don't have access to water. You simply don't. And it's just going to be incredibly costly for the environment, and also for those who are kind of supporting that. And it doesn't really, I know we talk about AI creating jobs or replacing jobs or transferring jobs, but I think data centers themselves are not massive job creators. It doesn't require very many people at all. It's not a job creator here in Dublin for sure. And every time I get excited because I see a new model that's really, really efficient, I think this is great. Now the consumption will come down over time. It will be like food production that we always worried about for increasing populations. But then you see demand shoot through the roof. Like when that last image generator came out from ChatGPT and they were doing 700 million images per day. That's insane to me. So I think that's something that we really need to consider over time. And MIT's done a really, really good technology review. Now, it's based on, as all of these things are, as mine are as well, it's based on imperfect calculations, because we're having to make certain assumptions. We're having to work with the data we have and kind of rely and crowd share and crowdsource calculations because of the black box nature of AI. But they have put some really, really nice things together. So I'll send you a link to this, because it's a really, really interesting summary of what we know about the energy required by the model programming and development, and then the subsequent energy requirements from use. And one of the things they say is that these servers that are feeding and training and building the model is a massive energy drain in and of itself. But that's a sunken cost for us. We can't control that. But I do like how they kind of frame some of the equivalences. They say it's very time consuming, it's very expensive, and training one model, not an update, not a kind of significant fine tuning, $100 million and 50 gigawatt hours of energy. And then they equate it to like powering San Francisco for 3 days. And that's for one single model. And if you have to do the drop down in ChatGPT, you can tell how many models they're working on almost simultaneously, or certainly in rapid succession, right? It's huge.
Mm-hmm. Do you hear of the companies like ChatGPT talking about this, or is there a silence?
Yes, I do. They are slowly addressing it as it becomes more and more of an issue. I think 12 months ago, it was not a topic of conversation at all. But I am noticing a slightly worrying trend in their approach to it. And I'll show you some things that I've noticed about that as well. Some observations, maybe not a concerted campaign, but their reaction reminds me of climate change denial. It's very similar. I don't know if you've seen this too, but for example, when they're questioned about the energy required, something like Grok, OpenAI, XAI, they were way behind and they needed a model, they needed it quickly, and they threw money at the problem, right? They bought 70% of the cooling in the US, and they had these, maybe not fully approved structures in the desert as they were training it at speed, and they caught up with 2 years of development in no time. And money was no object there. So therefore energy was no object. And I think that's significant, and I think if you would question somebody like Elon Musk, perhaps he would not worry about the environment particularly, and you wouldn't even feel the need to rationalize or defend it. But I think there are other companies like OpenAI who do want to be the good guys, who do want to kind of look like it's not a significant issue. So I think if you look at the fact that if we're planning ahead and we're extrapolating, by the end of this year, we've already surpassed the energy that AI will use. It's greater than the entire consumption of Thailand, for example. That's a statistic I read in this MIT report. I had been working on the assumption in the previous calculations that it was already at the Netherlands size. So it is escalating rapidly. I don't know if it's out of control yet, but it certainly is something to watch and worry about. Another point they mentioned is that by 2028, on current development, they mentioned that the AI specific use only, because of course data centers are not just AI, right? They're cloud servers, and they've been in existence for a very long time. But they're suggesting that all of the electricity, 22% of US households would be the equivalent energy. So 1 in 5 households gathered together, that's an insane amount of energy, right? Especially in the US where energy consumption is high and profligate. And I like that they make another good equivalence. They say this is the same emissions as driving a car for 300 billion miles. These are staggering. 1,600 round trips from the sun to the earth. And so if that's coming, unless something significantly changes, if this is the track we're on, that's something that I think we need to start discussing with students and kind of honestly discussing with ourselves too, before we generate an image, before we generate a deepfake video, because we know the text generation, this idea that we ask ChatGPT a question or we ask it to make something for us, that is low energy per task, but it's massively frequently used. It's huge. And I think that was the main focus at first, because the image generators were not amazing. They give a very definite look, right? When you generate an AI image, you can recognize it. So the image generation is growing in popularity as it gets better. And I think with the video, it's so good. The last VO3 that came out, I don't know if you've seen some of those videos, the really impressive ones. It's so close. If that's the iteration from 2 months ago to now, you can only imagine what next year will bring. And those are very high energy and they're very advanced capabilities. Even a 30-second clip is incredibly high. That's why they limit most of those models at the moment to like 5 to 8 seconds, unless you pay the big packages. So it isn't trivial costs. When they defend themselves and suggest that, well, this is only 1 watt hour, or this is, now we've brought it down to 0.3 watt hours. But the fact, if you think about it, I started to do some of the calculations where I took an average school size and multiplied it, like if they did 10 queries a day. And we know it's way more than that because they've moved from Google to ChatGPT for questions. Many students, not all, but many. And I saw some adults doing it a lot recently on their phone. In WhatsApp, in Meta AI, those kind of things, it's very quick to go to that to ask for advice or instructions. So I think the thing, if you start to project ahead, the thing I'm worried about is I listened to something the other day about robotics and how they're going to train humanoid robotics in a high-risk environment. So then the most natural thing is to put them into a 3D world environment, like a world map, like a computer game that people can generate infinite versions of. Can you imagine the energy that's going to require? Like a holodeck in the Star Trek, it's going to be massive. So I think that's where every iteration that they get better and better at is like Jevons paradox, right? The better they are, the lower the consumption, the lower the requirements, the higher the consumption. So that's one thing I think schools are thinking.
It's inevitable that these companies are going to end up having to produce their own energy, isn't it? I mean, they can't rely on states to provide enough. So, and then what will that do? What will that do for those who are already struggling to create their own energy when all the resources are going to these sorts of areas?
It's going to, and I think countries that would benefit from economic intervention might see this as an opportunity to say, yes, come on in, build a nuclear site, do what you like. And then they're beholden to that industry. And I think that's where we find ourselves in Ireland. We're beholden to the pharmaceutical industry and the tech industry. And if they want something, they'll usually get it. And I think somebody cynically said the billionaires always win. I think it's something that is, the fact, I'll speak about it in a moment, but the fact that the US has effectively cut loose any regulation requirement, and they can do what they need to do. The Department of Defense must give them their land if they need it. The Department of Energy must give them their land if they need it. We will make this happen for them because this is an arms race. I think that is a scary development. And if energy is the key to all that, we think about, in 2024, there were 15 billion images created, approximately, by their own admissions. And that's comparable to 7,500 tons of CO2, which at the time I thought I was quite staggered by that at the end of last year, but that's 1,600 cars worth of emissions. And then we surpassed that in the first 3 weeks of January alone. And I was like, oh my God, what is happening? And I started to calculate, and it was very difficult to get numbers at first. There's a lot more around now in the last couple of months, which is great, which means that people are taking this seriously and people are thinking about it. And again, I'm not anti-AI. I am trying to use it as well, but I'm trying to be as conscious with it as I can do, because if a single video can use that much energy, now, again, this is outdated. This figure is probably lower now with VO3, but until we know for sure, I'm going to use that as my baseline assumption. So, for example, there was a 3-fold increase in deepfakes during the election last year because everybody was making it Trump as a pope or whatever, the people on a dolphin, all these videos that each 1,000 of them is equivalent to 500 homes consumption for an entire year. And this works really well with students, actually, when I tell them, a 30-second deepfake video, you could watch every single episode of Friends streamed 5,000 times. And they feel streaming, right? They get it. They kind of get that idea that is massive. Because we don't put a cost or a price on interactions like that in a digital space, ever. I do like in Gemini, where it shows you the tokens that you're using. So you become more conscious of each interaction, how it does. And I think if we ignore Sam Altman's plea not to say please and thank you, because that seems like his problem and not ours, but I think it does underlie that fact that they are worried about the energy consumption of every single interaction and feeding that demand.
These numbers you're sharing, Rita, are just phenomenal. I was unaware of a lot of them.
I was too, until I went digging. And I only went digging because I had seen one person post that charging, doing an image in ChatGPT was the same as charging your phone 3 to 5 times. And that floored me, absolutely floored me. So I started digging. And that's what the IB is always good at, right? Inquiry and critical thinking. And it stood to us in this point because I thought, right, okay, I need to figure this out. I'm a mathematician. I can work out these equivalences. What are they? And I can give students something to think about. And then you get deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole and you start to really worry. And I had to pull myself back and think, well, I don't want to become a conspiracy theorist, but we have enough evidence from social media that big tech has not given us necessarily enough reason to trust them implicitly. And I think we have enough evidence from technology advancements that the financial imperative is also worth considering every time. And without wanting to go into like social engineering or manipulation or any of those kind of considerations, I think it's still worth us keeping an open mind to that it is really, truly important to think about what's happening to students' brains, what's happening to cognitive offloading. We've already gone through a period of memory offloading. Like I don't memorize anything anymore, do you?
No.
Not a single thing.
I put it down to age, but
Well, I did too, because I do like the phrase, before 35, everything's an innovation, and after 35, everything's an imposition. So I did think that. But the more I think about it, and I read The Anxious Generation over the weekend as well, I think that is really, really impacting how I perceive students' cognition development and what we're going to do to preserve that. How are we going to value embodied learning? What will human-to-human interaction look like? So many big, big things to think about. And the energy is just one small part of that. That if they are throwing $500 billion at Stargate in the US, and if they're throwing money at developing these incredible chips that will go 5x faster, and therefore 5x energy demand, higher or more, then it's something to consider. Then we have to really think about if each data center has 10 to 100, or in the future we'll have 1,000 racks because we need general intelligence more than we need anything else, then there is a cost. There's a massive cost to that. So I did see some people are, like I said, some people have started to talk about it. Ethan Mollick, who's just prolific in the AI space, both positive and negative, I guess, in terms of a really good critical thinker. I saw him equating something to the training energy required in, I think it was Llama. It's very small now. I'll have to read it again and check, but it's in terms of a Llama model, and talking about how many hours of streaming Netflix that was. I was glad to see that he was doing the same kind of equivalence that I was, or also 18 hours of a Boeing in flight. And that is huge. And I keep coming back to it, that is the thing that we need to think about before we use AI, as we engage with AI. What are we going to do in terms of education? So I have been trying, and I know some people think it's maybe a contradiction in terms, I've been trying to think about sustainable AI, sustainable for humanity and sustainable for the planet. And it is really crucial that we think about the promises and the perils in parallel. And if I have schools that are thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals, or if we're thinking about service to the community or global engagement, we don't want to walk into it energy blind. And I think we've been guilty of that in humanity before. We are significant consumers of resources of the planet. And that is it, and it's not showing up in our education currently at the moment. We haven't had time to digest it. Schools are so busy, and I've had the luxury of having some time to sit down, do the calculations, do the research. As a head of school, I could never do that. I just couldn't. As a teacher, I never had time for it. So I think that is where I'm trying to support that. I'm really glad that you've given me this opportunity. It's turning into a bit of a soapbox everywhere I go, to be honest. I think I'm wrecking people's heads, but it's really important because big tech are taking a very different position. And I think this is a classic where somebody posted a defense of ChatGPT where they say the water consumed. And we see this teeny tiny little error bar of the ChatGPT 300 queries is this much, and this much is a US home. And then, oh, naughty hamburger is this big. And I think it's important that we don't deny that meat production is a significant contributor. But it very, very conveniently sidesteps that, where he says, like, I particularly love when the anti-AI crowd makes stuff up about our water usage while they're eating a hamburger. And I think that's a very clever sleight of hand, right? Because the hamburger is an issue, and this is an additive. This is hugely, hugely important. And I remember this kind of argument happening when climate change denial was really taking hold. Do you remember that? Like, were they really making false equivalences and distractions?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They're past masters at it.
Yeah, I think so many people learned from the tobacco industry that, there are great consultants out there making a fortune. And we'll see more and more of this. I'm absolutely sure. I'm sure we'll see, like, look over there, not look over here, because it is such a useful defense strategy. Now, I'm not saying that he doesn't actually believe it. I'm sure he probably does. But 300 ChatGPT queries is now nothing. And I notice he doesn't mention images. He doesn't mention videos. He doesn't mention 3D world maps. He doesn't mention the inevitable AGI that they're all striving for and the energy that will require. And we're seeing that reflected in the access they have to power. They are certainly, like ChatGPT, we're in a meeting. I just read an article about it in a meeting with the Irish Department of Education. And we see Estonia is rolling it out. And we see that they've provided free access to Columbia University and to Harvard and to Yale and to Oxford and to Cambridge. And I think what a really rich source of data they've just got. They've got a dependency vehicle, of course, but they've also got access to what some would consider some of the finest minds in their most nascent stage. And I think when we see what the US has done, and they've framed AI as a national security imperative, because then it becomes highest priority. We cannot have computing infrastructure undefended, unsupported, unfed. And they need reliable, high-density energy sources. And they have no problem with nuclear energy. Like in Ireland, we just couldn't have a nuclear power plant. It would be politically just unthinkable. Well, I mean, maybe not in 10 years' time. Maybe things will change so much. If we see France and Germany now coming to a kind of entente cordiale about bringing back nuclear energy in Germany, which I could not have imagined 10 years ago. I just couldn't. No. It would have been impossible.
And I've got one down the road, me going up. Sizewell yesterday was given the green light. We knew it was happening, but yesterday it was finally official. They've been working on the infrastructure around Sizewell for months already. So, yeah, again, like you, that 70s, 80s, perhaps 90s, you'd think it's never going to happen. And now it's here.
I know we were paranoid. I was never allowed to swim in the Irish Sea because of Sellafield. Like it took a hold of the national imagination in a way that seems to have atrophied for sure. And I think if it can't be any coincidence that yesterday also Keir Starmer, had an AI press release in terms of what it means for education, because it was conspicuously absent in his last AI report. And now it's very go, go, go. It's like students need access to this. We need it because, Britain's in need of an economic driver currently. So it's understandable that defense and AI would be very attractive and we have to feed that through education. Of course, we have to bring the minds along to be able to carry out all of that. But the US has taken a very different stance. The EU AI Act places a huge amount of responsibility on the deployer and the creator of AI, and the uses in schools are very heavily defined. How we're going to protect students' agency, how we're going to protect autonomy. So we have a very regulated environment in the European Union. Will it still look like that in 5? Will it actually be toothless in a few years' time? I'm not sure. I think we thought it was going to follow a GDPR path. But then you have the US saying, no, 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 give them whatever they want. Give them, take away state regulation, take away local interest. Let's get rid of rights holders. We're not going to do any of that. Again, will that stand up under the pressure from courts? I'm not sure. But the idea that they've been empowered to such an extent that they can have whatever they want, whatever they need. And we will feed that with the education, overhaul and the Bill of Rights, the US Bill of Rights and things like that. I think privacy and autonomy are probably going to be the biggest victims in the face of that. Well, like what are we going to do in terms of the schools, and how will that affect it? Because it was an e-assessment focused, I thought, symposium, I thought it would be important to kind of place it in context for people. So I took an example from the MIT report and I transplanted it to an education system. So imagine you were trying to bring in AI marking, either as a board or as a school or as a school network. And you thought each time somebody writes a question. Now, in the old days, you would bring them into a room, somebody would propose a question, you rip it apart, the subject matter experts would, kind of put it back together, piece it together, and you get a good question when you see it. And that's a very robust process. It's also a very expensive process because you're paying for human expertise. You're flying people into a meeting because in-person development is easily the best. But you can imagine it as a teacher sitting at a desk also trying to use AI to write a question for an exam. So I took an estimate of like 15 questions. I want to brainstorm, write me a question. I don't like that. Let's do it again. Check this fact. Let's say 15 questions is about right for kind of a very simple ideation. And then I thought, well, once they've done that, an examiner would probably want to put a picture, potentially a diagram or an image, and you probably have about 10 attempts, unless you're much more intuitive and you have a great prompting style and you know exactly what you want and communicate it really well, which we don't all have kind of as a natural thing. So let's say there was about 10 image attempts until you got the exact right cross-section of an equipment setup or a picture of a trigonometry in real life type scenario that you needed to remove all of the distracting information and so on. And then I think maybe a 30-second video or a 10-second video or even a 5-second video explaining the question, because you often have to defend your question with an authorship team, of course. So I did a quick calculation of those, and based on their calculations, which I stuck to for the moment, that's about 2.9 kilowatts of energy required just to develop that single question, to get to a point where you'd like it, which is the same use as 10 miles in an EV car. Or, and this is the one that hits hard, 3.5 hours of microwaving. I should have done, what I should have done? I should have done a water boiler, because we all feel that one, right? When that's left on.
Yeah.
But I think that's a single question for a single test.
Yeah.
And we're using it as it's very attractive, because there's nothing worse. Say, for example, if you're at the IB and you want to use an image, there's copyright and there's a huge lengthy process to get permission to get it, even if it's copyright and there's no cost associated. So the IB understandably said, this is fantastic. We can have copyright-free images. Go, 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 authors. And then we need a moment to think about actually what's the implication of that? What's the law of unintended consequences telling me here? So I think that's important. And as we move to on-screen examinations, which is inevitable, it's already happening in some scenarios, with some of the US systems have moved on screen. NYP has been on screen as an exam for a while. And now diploma, we talk about, and A-level are talking about it, but I haven't heard anything significant recently. But there were lots of people talking about it at this conference. I mean, this is their main goal, is what's the future for on-screen assessment? So I decided to speak from the area I knew, which is the IB diploma. And like I said, we like authoring things that are copyright free. It makes life a lot easier, and you could get exactly the image that you need, not permission to use an image that's almost there and then you have to pay an animator to get it right or a designer to get it clearer. But if an examination board does that, we know that drives classroom practice. So to prepare them for the exam, we need to give them questions that look just like the exam. And we need to give them opportunities to practice the skills that they require. So not thinking about being in the lockdown environment or not thinking about being in the actual assessment portal, we still need to think about when we're writing a question and the memory is left on, or we're training the model or whatever, that information goes back into the system. So clever, good prompting students are going to be able to figure out, okay, this is a unit on this, it's a criterion here, here's my success. Tell me 10 questions you might ask. And probability speaking, the the sovereignty of your questions would come under pressure over time. Because AI does the most probable match, right? And they're going to do the most likely question that would fulfill that need. So eventually there are going to be data concerns and privacy concerns about people using AI to write questions, going back into the matrix, so to speak, but everything going back in there. And the temptation to use AI for marking will also be significant. So there'll be some prompt consumption there. If we want to use AI to analyze the question, it's no longer that it's just clicking and opening. It needs to use that processing all the time, that energy required. So I did a quick calculation, very rudimentary, very rough around the edges, but just to get us thinking about it. And I looked up in the IB diploma exams, there were 192,000 students taking an IB diploma in some form or other last year. And because this was not an education specific audience, I wanted to explain that means most students take 6 subjects, in which there are at least 2 papers. Now, some have 3 papers, but I didn't want to put that into the calculations. So if we think about that, just in a single question, if you have 192,000 students, 6 subjects, 2 papers, and then roughly I took a very low ball estimate of 10 questions per test. So if we think about each one of those questions, whether the kid writes something or nothing, the question would have to be opened and analyzed by AI. And that would mean that simply one question scaled up by that many people, that many subjects, and that many papers, 23 million unique queries. And we know that no question has a single part, that there are often subparts. So I think, okay, well, don't go too far, Rita. Now just give it 2 subparts. And then that's 56 million plus. And each of those requires energy. And and then to think about how that's May session, one single question on May session. So I think it's just the right moment to think, what are we doing? Let's just hang on. Let's just have a moment's pause and deliberation before we do this.
Absolutely. And also, going back to something you said at the beginning, what we're making today with the support of AI is not what we're going to need next year, because it's developing so much. So it's not as if these things you do them once and it will be there for the next 5-10 years. They'll probably redo them again next year, because they will think, well, we can do this better now.
Yeah, and I think the increase in, it's effectively a pattern spotting machine, right? Because it will continue to generate the kinds of questions that they've asked before. So those unique, interesting, really, those meaty questions that really determine what a student's made of, and an unusual question and a killer question, those won't exist as the model gets more and more of the same. It'll be a recursive, of course, so it will tend to give you the same kind of thing that went before. So the interestingness, that's not the right term. I guess the validity and the reliability of the assessment, those could be considered fine, absolutely flawless, but the deterioration of creativity would go unnoticed. And you do get that sometimes. You get somebody who pulls up an A-level question from 1967 and an A-level question from 2014 and compares them. And I've always found that really, really interesting. I would love to see it do for multiple years and in a longitudinal study and see where that drift comes in AI. And I suppose that now is the time to think about that before we have to do it after the fact and bemoan the loss or the degradation or whatever that might be. So I wanted them to think about for a moment, it has been commonly accepted that paper equals bad and screen equals good in e-assessment. And I think it's not necessarily the case. So there's a really good paper on techforgoodcanada.com where they've done a comparison of not using AI at all, just the significant CO2 impact between saving and opening a document versus having a paper document. And I think that's worth us. I'll send that to you as well, because that's worth reading. And I think it's fascinating that we haven't thought about that. But I am not by nature a doom and gloom person, and I'm certainly not anti-AI. And I hate when consultants come into a school, point to the obvious and then leave, or somebody tells me we now need to rethink education and then walks away. So I think it's important that you and I were talking about it earlier, and I could not agree more that small changes, significant iterations, and anything that we can do, however tiny, is really important. So one of the things I've been working with schools and some of our online courses really focus on is the idea of deliberation and conscious presence with AI. And so I have, written some resources to do with students, which is where they have to think like that purchasing. Do I really need it right now? What's it doing to my learning? Does it align with my goals? Could I defend it to a teacher? Will I still be proud of my work? And that we're not thinking about. I'm not thinking about the pride or the desire that students want another human to look at the thing they pour time, energy, and potentially love into. And I think that will become more and more important. We're already hearing many students, affected by teacher use of AI and negatively impacted, and their feelings being hurt, or in some cases, them suing the university for overuse of AI. We're seeing that develop in the US. So we need practical ideas as to what can we ourselves do. If we want greener AI, besides trying to find a sustainable energy provider, for example, that's not a practical thing, but asking ourselves, each tool that we adopt in schools, each use case that we start to use AI for, each time somebody comes really cheerleading AI, we need to ask ourselves, is this tool necessary to achieve learning? Is this something that it can do better for students than I could do? Is this a facility that would be impossible to achieve, or is it a time saver? And if it is a time saver, what will we protect that time for? Because there has been a situation recently where some real cheerleading advocates of AI advertised within their school saying, I've saved myself 10%, I've saved myself 20%, and then the school gives them another class. So as a teacher, that hits me in the solar plexus, that I finally regressed to the mean of teaching before email. I got my time back. I can now concentrate on my professionalism, and productivity rears its ugly head. So I think if we're going to save time, let's preserve that time for something meaningful educationally, or well-being, or any of the other things that we know we could use more time for. If we are choosing models, if we're thinking, okay, the school's going to adopt Gemini, or we're going to start writing tests with it, but we want the best privacy model, we want the lowest energy consumer, we want really intentional choices. And I was also asking them, which doesn't affect your audience, but I was also asking them to think about, as they move to on-screen assessments, what are the other energy peripheral costs? If you need an on-screen exam, you need school-owned and school-checked and school-verified and supported devices, whatever that might be. You also get devices that are going to be not sustainable for very long under new requirements. So suddenly you're having to do that lifetime of your IT lab is suddenly shorter and shorter and shorter. And as a former head of school, that would have been difficult for me to introduce a new line item every time there's a new exam requirement. So I think the electronic waste, the models that they use, which would then impact school choices, are really significant. They're so much more meaningful than I think people have realized, that wherever they move, the community will move with them. And to make an informed choice like that, there's I think he's the CEO or maybe the CTO of Salesforce. He's been very, very vocal in trying to make companies much more accountable and transparent with their use. So this is a great thing to look up. It's an AI energy score leaderboard, and it's interactive and it changes depending on your use and things. And it looks like this. And I would refer to this quite regularly because they mentioned there, you see in the top corner, very, very small, there is a 61,848 times difference between the highest and lowest energy use in the leaderboard. Now, maybe some of them will meet demand, maybe some of them will not be suitable for your requirements, but I'm not asking it PhD level questions. I can use any of them, and if I like the output, I'll stick with it for that use, and then I'll switch for another use. And lower down, when you're looking at specific GPU, or if you're looking at CPU and all of these changes, even within those, there's a 20x difference or a 22x difference between the highest and the lowest. So I do try and go to the model that will meet my needs best for the lowest requirement, whatever that may be. If an exam board did that, then schools would emulate that, which would be great. It also means that I put myself on an energy diet, and I often say it's the only diet I'm on, but it is genuinely important. So I do try and I will always ask myself before I reach for AI, which I didn't do 6 months ago. I will always ask myself, do I actually need this? Am I being lazy? Will it churn out something mediocre? So I do the same deliberation, but that I would ask students and teachers to do too. And I was asking them to think, just because it's new and shiny, and we want to put it everywhere, and it sounds sexy on business statements or advertising or marketing, whatever, could we just hang on and think, does this actually increase efficiency in anything? Are we reducing friction for the sake of reducing friction? Because we in schools know the friction is actually really, really useful. Like productive struggle is really important for learning. And the more that we do that, the more we increase our carbon footprint to make life easier for students. It's laudable, but it's not desirable. And I think I was asking them to think about like where they can evidence that it will support assessment to drive education. Where could we scale it back? Where can we actually say, no, we're not going to put it in here, not to be puritanical about it, but to say it doesn't actually add value here. It undermines something that we hold really dear in education. So I was trying to explain to them, we need a really honest disclosure culture, because I'm sure you've seen it, getting AI emails from people. It's really disheartening, isn't it?
Absolutely.
The
Yeah,
slop.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
You lose respect for them, or you feel a lack of their voice and a lack of a connection.
yeah.
So I was saying to them, when I do a presentation or when I do some research, I always try and add an AI disclosure now and say, for this presentation today, I did 13 Claude queries, 3 Gemini, and 2 ChatGPT. So I calculated roughly what that would be in energy use. Didn't do any videos, didn't do any images, didn't do any slides. Now, I'm not trying to judge those people who do, but I think it would be good to be really clear and transparent about it. With our students, if we were modeling that for students, it would be great. They wouldn't feel like we were trying to use it against them behind their back and then punish them for the use of it in a very, very hypocritical way. And that is happening in some instances, not many. Some teachers are doing amazing jobs at modeling effective and ethical practice with students, but many people are using it as a kind of a covert enhancer and not necessarily owning it. And I did one deep research query, which does require a great deal of energy. So it's very hard to buy CO2 credits that you could trust it independently as a person. You can do it industry wise very well, but I've just taken to planting trees because I can't think of another way to offset this incredible consumption that I'm doing. And my garden's getting ridiculous, and Anna is having to expand it because every time we do a trip to a school, we also try and offset the CO2 of the flights, because it's not an either or. Like, that's where Sam Altman is wrong. It's not a don't look here, look over there. We have to add it all together and consider our place in time and space and what we're doing. Because if we want to be good ancestors, or if we want to live by, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, the second best time is now, then we have to take action now. This is the one moment in this development where we have actually an opportunity to learn from all of these mistakes that we've made in the past, rather than be disheartened, rather than to give up power and control and autonomy, to say, hang on a second, we can control, at least within our school, what this looks like. And we can't enforce it, but we can certainly enhance our best practices to deal with that. So essentially, that was the presentation I made to them yesterday. It's a presentation that I'd make to this group as well, that I would ask that we're education pioneers. We lead the way. We have the opportunity to act with purpose and responsibility around AI. And I know there's regulation requirements and there's pedagogic reasons as well for adopting it. So I say, yes, let's do those things. Let's meet all of those demands together and introduce ethical and sustainable practices wherever we can. Put it in a policy, put it into the submission requirements for an assessment, put it into our meetings, think about it in our assemblies, whatever we can do to model really healthy use of AI, and then make a commitment that we are going to be pioneers of sustainable innovation, that we will be the ones to make these decisions for education, not companies that think they know what education wants and what education needs or what will sell, appealing to our need to save time. It may or may not be worth preserving, whatever that is. So I think that we want to be super conscious, conscientious, ethical, sustainable. Whenever we use AI, it has to be for a really good reason. And most of the time now, I find when I'm using it, I'm happy with the results. I'm very efficient with AI. Good writers can get good writing out very quickly. Good thinkers can recognize good AI use very quickly. And the IB is so good at that, right? The ATLs are just everywhere for that kind of thing. So are other education systems. They don't have a monopoly on critical thinking. So if we can really amplify that in our students' use, then we have a good chance to kind of come out of this with the best possible outcome for the planet and for our students' minds and for technology and progress. So that I just put up my QR code for them at the end so that they could connect, because many of them wanted the slides and many of them want to continue the conversation, hopefully. But for me, I think, really what I wanted to share with you today. I wanted to talk, because I know this has been on your mind. You've been thinking about this and kind of wrestling with AI for schools too.
Absolutely. I love that, Reed. Thank you so much for sharing that. I have learned a huge amount just from that last 45 minutes. So thank you. I particularly loved at the end your AI disclosure idea. I think that's a fantastic idea, because not only does it share with others what we've done, it also makes us reflect on how we've used it. And I think that's a really good small step to start with. Is just focusing on what I've done and how my impact may be making or contributing to the bigger impact of this new technology. So thank you so much for all that. I know you'll be happy for people to contact you and ask you more questions and ask you to talk with them. I've just got one last question about what sort of conversations have you had with young people about AI? We were sharing at the beginning my children and their view of it, and they're much more, I think skeptical and possibly hostile towards it. Now, I have a son who is an English student and a historian, and he sees it as a real threat to skills that he's developed over the last 2 years doing his A levels. What sort of conversations have you had with young people about AI and the use of AI in their education?
It's really interesting because with a plan of learning, I've been in many schools and we've had other practitioners in many schools, and we always find an opportunity to talk to students, and you will always get a diversity of thought, which is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think I also see sometimes, or I hear from students, something similar to what your son thinks, but more along the lines of, do you remember when we started teaching them digital literacy and everything became fake news everywhere, and no matter what it was, whether it was true or untrue, they would say fake news. There's an element of that where they, there was a little while where they were calling it trash GPT, but that faded out very quickly with the newer models. So, and there's an element of, well, everybody's using it, so why shouldn't I? There's also an element of, in some conversations with students, where they will be very quick. They won't admit to the use, but if you ask them how their friends are using it, they can give you a very detailed breakdown of what are the best humanizers, what are the best detection avoiders, how did they learn this? Well, they're targeted with it on TikTok. So they do, there is an awful lot of expertise sharing. There are some people who really like it as a learning tool, so preparing for exams. When I ask them how long that learning lasts, they can't really answer. So they don't feel like it's permanent learning. It's very much learning to the test to be forgotten very quickly afterwards. There are other students, the younger ones. I have a 10-year-old, and obviously I'm not letting her near it yet, but I'm letting her watch my use of it, and we're having conversations about how the algorithm is targeted and so on. So I'm trying to get her to critically evaluate and think. But I've noticed recently it has started to seep into her media landscape. So I picked up her Beano the other day. She likes to read her Beano and throw them everywhere. And I picked it up and it was in there. It was in his story for Dennis the Menace, I think. Was it, or Minnie the Minx, or one of those. And the storyline was that he was using AI to decide which sweets he was going to buy with his pocket money. And I thought, my God, first of all, oh my God, it's here. And second, I was like, oh, the one thing kids can do really well for themselves, pick which sweets they're going to buy? Really? And the offloading that I could see in the message. And then, of course, then he blew the computer up with too many questions. And then he had to go and ask his mom and da-da-da. So it was part of the storyline. But the fact that it was part of the storyline and no reference to kids to have to explain what it was, that it's just assumed knowledge, that was big for me. And then I saw it in her TV show. I saw it in her cartoons. I kind of expected it in her cartoons because cartoons are often, obsessed with robotics and things like that, and intelligence in various forms and superheroes. So that wasn't surprising. But to hear her say, instead of like just Google it, when she said just AI it, I thought, this is interesting. This is a tipping point.
Yeah.
So I think that has, when I was working, we were talking about a curriculum earlier on, we have been developing all these courses for teachers. And then I realized that once the teachers are fully trained and aware, they then need resources, they then need ideas, they then need clarity. And this is what I used to do at the IB, so it became second nature. So I started to think about, what does embodied learning look like? How would we teach that in a class? And where are we going to find time for it? Because our curriculum are already overfull. So how can we embed it? How can we integrate it? So that's been kind of taken over my life recently, developing those things. And I went back as far as early years, where we don't want kids on a screen any more than they have to be. We know that. But we also know that China is developing a 3 to 18 full AI curriculum. So how will our students compete in a workforce in 15 to 20 years time without that knowledge? So it's been a real delicate balance. But again, if people are interested in learning more about that, I'd love to share with them. But I think all of this is important. All of the professional thinking, all of the learning, all of the epistemic responsibility, it's very weighty. It's a lot to think about, but it's such a valuable thing to do right now.
Rita, thank you so much for your time today. And I hope we have more conversations in the future about other aspects of AI.
Likewise. Thank you too.